Deep in the Libyan desert, where the dunes run to the horizon like a frozen ocean, there are silent cities. Mud brick walls half swallowed by sand, no water for hundreds of miles, and no one to remember who built them. This is one of the driest places on the planet. Less than 1 inch of rain falls here in a year. Nothing should grow. And yet, 2,000 years ago, this sand was green with grain. They had no rivers, no rain, no lakes, so they did something no one believed possible in a desert. They went underground and they found water that had been hidden for tens of thousands of years. For centuries, Rome called them savages. Raiders from the deep desert who appeared out of the dust, struck the frontier, and vanished back into a wasteland no army dared to follow. But Rome was wrong. Behind that wall of dust stood a kingdom, walled towns, painted tombs, oasis farms, and a trade network that reached from the Mediterranean to the heart of Africa. We call them the Garamantes. For a long time, they were a footnote in someone else's history, mentioned only by the enemies who feared them. Then archaeologists went looking, and the ground gave up its secret. Beneath the sand lay hundreds of miles of underground channels dug by hand that turned a desert into a garden. It was one of the boldest feats of engineering in the ancient world, and it carried inside it the seed of their destruction. Because the water they found could not be replaced. It was fossil water, sealed under the sand since the last ice age, and every drop they pulled up was a drop the desert would never give back. For 500 years they flourished. Kings, priests, farmers, merchants, a whole world born from water that was always quietly running out. And then the wells began to dry, the channels ran empty, the fields turned back to dust. One by one, the towns fell silent. The Garamantes are not a legend. They were real. Their cities are real. Their underground rivers are real. And so is the warning they left behind for us. This is the story of a people who farmed the Sahara with rivers no one could see, who built a civilization on borrowed water, and who teach us across 2,000 years what happens when the water runs out. To understand the Garamantes, you first have to understand where they lived. Look at a map of the Sahara, and your eye slides over a great blank space in the middle of southern Libya. The Romans called this region the Fazania. Today we call it the Fezzan. It is a land of stone plateaus, black volcanic ridges, and seas of pale dune that move with the wind. There are no permanent rivers here. There is no rain to speak of. In a good year, a thumb's width of water might fall from the sky. In most years, none falls at all. For anyone standing in the Fezzan today, the idea that a civilization could rise here seems absurd. The heat in summer can climb past 50 degrees. The horizon shivers. The silence is total. This is not the soft desert of postcards. It is one of the most extreme environments on the face of the earth, a place where the margin between life and death is measured in a single day without water. And yet, scattered across this emptiness, there are walls, there are wells. There are the bones of towns. The land remembers a time when it was not empty at all. To find out how that was possible, we have to travel back far past the Garamantes themselves to a Sahara that no living person has ever seen, a Sahara that was green. The Sahara has not always been a desert. This is one of the most important facts in the whole story, and it is easy to miss. The greatest desert on earth is not permanent. It breathes. Over tens of thousands of years, it swells and shrinks, driven by slow wobbles in the planet's orbit that change how much sunlight falls on the northern half of the world. When the conditions are right, the monsoon rains push north and the desert blooms. The last time this happened, the change was extraordinary. Beginning roughly 11,000 years ago, the Sahara turned green. Scientists call this the African humid period. Where there are now dunes, there were lakes. Where there is now bare rock, there were grasslands and shallow rivers. Hippos wallowed in waters that today lie under hundreds of feet of sand. Crocodiles swam where nothing now lives. Herds of elephants, giraffes, and wild cattle moved across an open green savanna. We are not guessing at this. The evidence is carved into the rock. Across the Sahara, including the highlands near the Fezzan, Ancient people left thousands of paintings and engravings on cliff walls and in caves. They show the animals of a wetter world, and they show the human beings who hunted and herded among them. This was the cradle, and out of it, eventually, the ancestors of the Garamantes would come. The rock art of the Sahara is one of the great galleries of the ancient world, and it tells a story in layers. The oldest paintings show wild animals of the savanna, the hunters who stalked them, and a world thick with life. Later layers show something different. They show domesticated cattle, herders moving with their herds, and a way of life built on tending animals rather than chasing them. The desert was already changing, and the people were changing with it. Then, beginning around 7,000 years ago and accelerating over the following millennia, the rains failed. The orbital cycle turned, the monsoon retreated south, the lakes shrank, then vanished, the grass died, the savanna dried out, and the sand returned, swallowing the green world almost completely. This was not a single dramatic event. It was a slow strangling, spread across thousands of years, and the people who lived through it would barely have noticed it within a single lifetime. But its effect was total. As the surface water disappeared, the herders had a brutal choice. They could follow the retreating rains south into the heart of Africa, they could move toward the coast in the Nile, or they could stay, gathering in the few places where water still survived, and find some way to live in a land that was turning year by year into a furnace. The Garamantes were the descendants of the people who chose to stay. Imagine that choice across 100 generations. Each one inheriting a slightly drier world than the one before, each one watching a familiar spring weaken, a familiar pasture thin out, a familiar lake pull back from its old shoreline. There was no single moment of crisis, no day on which the green Sahara ended. There was only the long, patient retreat of water and the steady gathering of people into the places that water had not yet abandoned. In the Fezzan, those places were the depressions and valleys where the land dipped low enough to reach groundwater and where date palms could take root. These oases became islands of life in an ocean of sand. They were small, scattered, and fragile, but they were enough to hold a population in place. And crucially, the people who gathered there were not starting from nothing. They carried with them the knowledge of generations, how to herd, how to grow, how to read a harsh land for the signs of hidden water. This is the deep root of the Garamantes. They were not invaders who arrived in the desert from somewhere greener. As far as the archaeology can tell us, they were the children of the Sahara itself, a people shaped by the drying of their own homeland who would answer the desert's challenge with one of the most ingenious solutions in human history. The first time the Garamantes step into the written record, it is not their own voice we hear, it is the voice of their neighbors and enemies far to the north. The earliest mention comes from the Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century before the Common Era. He describes a people he calls the Garamantes, living deep in the interior of Libya, and even at this distance, through hearsay and rumor, a few real details survive. Herodotus tells us they were a very great nation. He says they spread soil over the salt to grow crops, a strange detail that may be a garbled memory of real oasis farming. He claims they herded cattle that walked backward as they grazed because their horns curved so far forward they could not move ahead while feeding, a story that is almost certainly a traveler's tall tale. And he reports that they hunted other desert peoples from 4-horse chariots, a detail that, remarkably, the archaeology would later support. We have to be careful here. Herodotus wrote from a great distance, repeating what traders and travelers told him, and he never set foot in the Fezzan. Some of what he says is clearly legend. But buried inside the legend are seeds of truth, confirmed centuries later by spade and trowel. From the very beginning, the Garamantes come to us this way, half real, half rumor, a people glimpsed through the dust, raised by their own chariots. That detail about the chariots deserves a moment of its own because it is one of the bridges between legend and proof. For a long time, the idea of war chariots racing across the Sahara sounded like fantasy. Then researchers began cataloging the rock art of the desert once more, and they found them. carved and painted on cliffs across the central Sahara, including routes leading toward the Fezzan, are images of light, fast chariots drawn by teams of horses. These are not the heavy battle chariots of the great river empires. They are spare, swift vehicles built for speed across open ground. They trace lines across the desert that some scholars believe mark ancient trade and raiding routes, the arteries along which goods, people, and power move through a landscape that looks to us completely impassable. The chariot was a technology of mobility, and in a world of vast distances and scattered oases, mobility was everything. We should not overstate it. We cannot prove that every chariot in the rock art belonged to the Garamantes, and the dating of much of this art remains debated among specialists. But the broad picture holds. Here was a desert people who had mastered the horse and the chariot, who could strike far and fast, and who used that reach to dominate the trade and the peoples of the central Sahara. Herodotus, for all his tall tales, had caught a true echo. At the heart of the Garamantian world stood a capital. Its name was Garama, and its ruins lie today near the modern village of Germa in southern Libya. For a desert people supposedly made up of wandering raiders, Garama is a revelation. This was a real city with walls, with monumental buildings, with streets and houses, and a population that may have numbered in the thousands. It was the political and spiritual center of a kingdom, and it endured for centuries. The Garamantes, built in mud brick, the natural material of an oasis world, shaping the earth itself into homes, storehouses, and temples. At its height, Garama was not a lonely outpost, but the hub of a network. Around it and across the Fezzan, archaeologists have identified the remains of many other settlements, dozens of villages and smaller towns knitted together into a single organized society. This was not chaos at the edge of the world. It was a state, and it was a state with reach. The objects found at Garama and nearby sites did not all come from the desert. There is fine pottery from the Roman Mediterranean, glass, glazed wares, and goods that could only have arrived along the trade routes. The Garamantes were not isolated. They sat at the crossroads of a continent, the gatekeepers of the Sahara, channeling goods between the green lands of the south and the markets of the Roman coast. The savages of Roman propaganda were, in truth, a nation of farmers, builders, and merchants. For most of the modern era, almost none of this was understood. The Garamantes were dismissed when they were thought of at all as a minor, barbarian tribe on the fringe of the Roman world, hardly worth a chapter. That picture began to crack in the 20th century, and it shattered with the work of one project above all. The British archaeologist David Mattingly and his teams, working across the Fezzan over many years, transformed a footnote into a civilization. Through careful excavation at Garama and across the oases, through the study of pottery, buildings, burials, and above all the irrigation systems, they pieced together the true scale of what the Garamantes had achieved. They mapped settlements, they counted tombs, they dated the rise and fall of the kingdom with a precision no one had managed before. What emerged was not a tribe, but an organized desert state, complex, wealthy, and far older and longer lived than anyone had imagined. This is the part of the story that matters most for honesty. Almost everything solid we know about the Garamantes, we know because patient people went into one of the harshest deserts on earth and dug. The romance of lost civilizations can tempt us toward fantasy, toward giants and vanished super races. The truth is better and harder. It was won slowly, brick by brick, sherd by archaeologists in the heat, separating what the evidence shows from what we merely wish were true. Now we come to the heart of it, to the single achievement that made everything else possible, and that, in the end, would doom it. In a land with no rivers and almost no rain, the Garamantes built rivers of their own. They built them underground by hand, and they ran for hundreds of miles beneath the desert. This was their masterpiece, and it is the reason their kingdom could exist at all. The technique is known by several names across the ancient world. In Iran and Central Asia, it is called the Qanat. In North Africa, it is called the Foggara. The principle is the same, and it is beautifully simple in idea, brutally hard in execution. You find a place where groundwater sits in the ground, often at the foot of high ground where the water table is closer to the surface. Then you dig a gently sloping tunnel, only slightly tilted, that carries that water by gravity alone, slowly downhill to the fields in the town where you need it. The gentleness of that slope is everything. Tilt the tunnel too steeply, and the rushing water tears the channel apart. Tilt it too little, and the water sits still and stagnates. The builders had to hold a precise, almost invisible gradient across miles of darkness underground with no modern instruments, working by feel, by water level, and by hard-won experience. To do this once would be impressive. The Garamantes did it again and again and again until the desert under their feet was threaded with hidden water. To dig a Foggara, you cannot simply tunnel blindly through the earth for miles. You need air for the workers to breathe, you need to remove the rubble, and you need to keep the tunnel running straight and true. So the builders sank a line of vertical shafts down from the surface, spaced at regular intervals along the route, each one dropping down to meet the tunnel below. From the air, a Foggara looks like a dotted line stitched across the desert, a long row of small craters marching toward the horizon. Down each shaft went the diggers, lowered into the dark to hack at the rock and earth with simple tools. The spoil they cut was hauled up and dumped around the mouth of the shaft, leaving the ring-shaped mounds that survive to this day. It was claustrophobic, dangerous, exhausting work. Tunnels could collapse, air could run short, and it had to be done not once, but on a scale that staggers the imagination across an entire landscape. When archaeologists added up the total length of all the Foggaras the Garamantes are thought to have dug across the Fezzan, the figure was astonishing. The combined channels are estimated to run for hundreds of miles, and the count of vertical shafts reaches into the many thousands. By any measure, in any age, this was a monumental act of collective labor, an entire civilization's strength poured into the patient pursuit of water. There is a question that hangs over the Foggaras, and honesty demands we name it. Where did the Garamantes learn to build them? The Kanat technology is ancient and widespread, with deep roots in the lands of Persia and the Near East. Some scholars argue the idea traveled to the Sahara from the east, carried along trade routes, and adopted by the Garamantes for their own desert. Others emphasize how thoroughly the Garamantes made it their own, adapting it to local conditions on a scale rarely matched anywhere. We do not have a firm answer, and we should not pretend to. The precise path by which the technology reached the Fezzan remains a genuine question among specialists, a matter of evidence and argument rather than settled fact. What is not in doubt is what the Garamantes did with it, whether they invented the method or imported it. They deployed it across their homeland with a commitment and an ambition that turned a survival technique into the foundation of a state. And here lies the quiet tragedy at the center of the whole story. The Foggara worked because it tapped water that lay beneath the desert, but that water was not being replenished. It was fossil water, ancient rains stored up during the Green Sahara, sealed underground for tens of thousands of years. The Garamantes were not drawing on a renewing river. They were drawing down a buried inheritance, and an inheritance, however vast, can only be spent once. For as long as the water flowed, the result was a miracle of green. Where the Foggaras emptied out, the Garamantes laid out their fields and gardens, irrigated channels feeding row upon row of crops in the shade of the date palms. In the most hostile desert on earth, they grew an abundance that would have astonished anyone who knew the land only as a wasteland. The evidence for what they grew is real and detailed, recovered from the ground itself by archaeologists sieving the soil of their sites. They cultivated wheat and barley, the classic grains of the ancient Mediterranean world. They grew dates, sorghum, and pulses. There are traces of grapes, figs, and other fruits. Most strikingly, they grew crops with origins far to the south in sub-Saharan Africa alongside crops from the Mediterranean north, a mixing of two agricultural worlds in a single oasis. The Garamantes fields were a meeting point of a continent's harvest. This abundance is what turned a cluster of oases into a kingdom. A reliable food surplus meant that not everyone had to farm. It freed hands to dig the Foggaras, to build the towns, to make pottery and trade goods, to fight, to rule, and to serve the gods. Surplus is the engine of complexity, and the Foggaras were the source of the surplus. Every loaf of bread, every painted tomb, every shipment sent north to Rome rested in the end on water lifted out of the dark. Control of water gives control of people, and the Garamantes understood this better than anyone. To dig and maintain hundreds of miles of underground channels required organized, coordinated labor on a massive scale, sustained across generations. This was not the work of free farmers tending their own small plots. It implies authority. It implies a society with rulers who could command labor, gather it, direct it, and feed it. The Foggara was not only an engineering project, it was a political one. The archaeology supports a picture of a stratified society with elites who lived differently from the rest. At Garama and across the Fezzan, the richest burials are set apart, furnished with imported goods, fine pottery, and objects of status that the ordinary dead did not receive. Above this society, the written sources point to kings, a ruling line at the head of the Garamantian state. We do not know their names or their deeds in detail, but the shape of a monarchy is there in the evidence. And beneath the elites, supporting the whole structure, was labor that was not always free. Here we touch one of the darker threads of the story, one we must follow with care rather than turn away from. The Garamantes sat astride the trade routes of the Sahara, and among the goods that moved along those routes were human beings. To understand the wealth of this desert kingdom, we have to understand its trade, and that trade had a human cost. Geography made the Garamantes rich. They occupied the central Sahara, the great middle ground between two worlds. To their north lay the Mediterranean coast, and in time, the markets of the Roman Empire, hungry for the exotic goods of inner Africa. To their south lay the lands beyond the desert, sources of products that the Mediterranean prized and could not produce. And in between lay the Garamantes, holding the roots, the wells, and the knowledge of how to cross the sand alive. No one moved goods across that desert without dealing with the people who controlled the water and the way. The Garamantes were the indispensable middlemen of trans-Saharan trade, the brokers who linked sub-Saharan Africa to the classical Mediterranean centuries before the famous caravan empires of the later medieval age. Goods flowed north and south through their hands, and a share of the value stuck to those hands along the way. From the south came gold, ivory, exotic animals and skins, and other products of the African interior. From the north came the manufactured wealth of the Roman world, fine red pottery, glass vessels, wine, oil, and luxury items, the very objects archaeologists now pull from Garamantian sites. This exchange knit the desert kingdom into the wider economy of the ancient Mediterranean. The Garamantes were not isolated barbarians at the world's edge. They were a vital artery in the commerce of an entire hemisphere. But among the goods that crossed the Sahara were people. The trade in enslaved human beings captured in the lands south of the desert and sold toward the Mediterranean is part of the Garamantian story, and we cannot tell that story honestly while leaving it out. The wealth of the kingdom, the labor that dug the Foggaras, the bodies that worked the fields were bound up with the buying and selling of people who had no say in their fate. We should be careful about the exact scale and mechanics, because the evidence is partial and the subject is heavy. We do not have ledgers or census rolls. What we have are scattered references in ancient writers, the implications of the trade routes, and the demands of an economy that required enormous amounts of labor in a place where free hands were scarce. From these, scholars reconstruct a society in which slavery and the slave trade played a real and significant part. The details remain debated. The fact of it does not. This is part of what it means to look at a lost civilization honestly. It is tempting to romanticize the Garamantes, to see only the genius of the Foggaras and the green miracle of the fields. But the same society that achieved those wonders also rested in part on coercion and human bondage. Both things are true at once. The capacity to build something magnificent and the willingness to build it on the suffering of others have lived side by side in human history far more often than we like to admit. To the north of the Garamantes lay a power that would shadow much of their recorded history, Rome. As the Roman Empire spread along the coast of North Africa, its frontier pressed toward the edge of the deep desert, and the two worlds came into contact. The relationship that followed was not a simple one. It swung between violence and commerce, between the clash of armies and the quiet, constant flow of trade. The Garamantes raided, striking out of the desert from their chariots and later, on horseback and camel, they fell upon the settled lands and trade routes of the Roman frontier, then withdrew into a wasteland that Roman armies could not easily follow. To the Romans, this made them a menace, a name to be cursed on the southern border, raiders who appeared out of nowhere and dissolved back into the sand. It is largely from these hostile encounters that the Roman image of the Garamantes as savages was born. In the first century before the Common Era and the first century after, Rome struck back. A Roman general led an expedition deep into Garamantian territory, reaching their settlements and, by some accounts, the region of their capital itself, in a campaign meant to teach the desert kingdom a lesson. Roman writers record these thrusts into the Fezzan with pride, but Rome never truly conquered the Garamantes. The desert was its own defense. Punitive expeditions could reach Garama, but they could not hold it. The kingdom endured. Over time, the relationship shifted from confrontation toward accommodation. Raiding gave way more and more to trade. It served both sides better. Rome wanted the gold, ivory, and exotic goods that only the Garamantes could deliver from beyond the desert. The Garamantes wanted Roman wine, oil, pottery, and the prestige that imported luxuries conferred on their elite. War is expensive. Commerce for both parties was profitable. The archaeology makes this turn visible. The sheer quantity of Roman material found at Garamantian sites, the fine red tableware, the glass, the amphorae that once held wine and oil, speaks of a relationship that became, for long stretches, far more about the marketplace than the battlefield. The Desert Kingdom and the Mediterranean Empire settled into a kind of partnership, each profiting from what the other could supply. The Garamantes were no longer just the enemy at the gate, they were a trading partner across the sand. This is the picture that the patient work of archaeologists has restored. The old story told only by Roman writers was a story of barbarians and frontier raids. The fuller story told by the objects in the ground is of a sophisticated desert state that could fight Rome when it had to and do business with Rome when it paid better. For centuries that balance held, and the Garamantes flourished in their improbable kingdom of underground water. What was it like to live in the Garamantian world at its height? The archaeology lets us sketch an answer with care. Daily life turned on the rhythm of the oasis, the tending of the Foggaras, the working of the irrigated fields, the harvest of dates and grain, the firing of pottery, the weaving of cloth, the long labor of keeping a town alive in a place that wanted it dead. It was a life of skill, of constant maintenance, of a community holding the desert at bay together. The towns themselves were built of mud brick, the walls thick to keep out the heat of the day and to hold warmth against the cold of the desert night. Homes, storehouses for the precious grain, workshops, and public buildings clustered together, often within defensive walls. People made and used a distinctive local pottery alongside the prized imports from the north. They wore textiles, adorned themselves with beads and ornaments, and surrounded themselves with the small objects of an ordinary settled life, the same kinds of things that fill any town in any age. And they were not a small or fleeting experiment. The Garamantian civilization, in its mature form centered on Garama, flourished for roughly half a millennium with roots reaching back further still into the centuries before. 500 years is a vast span. It is longer than many famous empires lasted. Generation after generation was born, lived, and died in these desert towns, knowing no other world, trusting that the hidden water would keep flowing as it always had. For a very long time, it did. If the towns tell us how the Garamantes lived, their tombs tell us how they understood death and how they wished to be remembered. The Fezzan is dotted with their cemeteries, and the number of graves is extraordinary. Across Garamantian territory, archaeologists have recorded many thousands of tombs, a density of burial that speaks of a large, long-settled population and a people who took the dead seriously. The tombs take many forms, from simple graves to more elaborate monuments, and the richest among them were furnished for the journey beyond. The dead were buried with grave goods, with the imported pottery and glass that marked status in life, with offerings and ornaments. Some tombs were marked with standing stones, and near certain burials, archaeologists have found offering tables and stelae, the furniture of a cult of the dead in which the living continued to honor and feed their ancestors. From these silent stone witnesses, we can read the outlines of belief, though we must be honest that the inner life of Garamantian religion is largely lost to us. We can see that they distinguished rich from poor even in death. We can see that they believed the dead needed provision and that the bond between the living and their sleeping ancestors mattered enough to build for. The names of their gods, the words of their prayers, the shape of their afterlife, these have mostly vanished with the people themselves, leaving only the stones and our questions behind. To grasp the fragility hidden inside the Garamantian achievement, we have to return to the Foggaras and think about how they actually worked over time. A Foggara taps the water table, the level below which the ground is saturated with water. As long as that level stays high, the tunnel flows. But the water in the Fezzan aquifers was fossil water, laid down in the wet ages of the green Sahara and not significantly renewed. Every year the Garamantes drew from it, the great underground reservoir dropped a little lower. This created a slow, merciless trap. As the water table fell, the existing Foggaras began to run dry because their gently sloping tunnels now sat above the sinking water. To keep the water coming, the Garamantes had only one answer: dig deeper and dig farther. Extend the tunnels back toward higher ground, sink new shafts, chase the retreating water into the earth. For a time, more labor could solve the problem. The kingdom could outrun its own thirst by working harder, but this is a race that cannot be won forever. Each new extension required more digging, more shafts, more lives spent in the dark to recover the same water that had once flowed freely. The effort needed to sustain the system climbed steadily, even as the resource it depended on shrank. A civilization built on a non-renewing resource is living on a slope, and the slope only ever tilts one way. The Garamantes had built their entire world on water that was, slowly and silently, running out. There is a cruel paradox buried in this. The very success of the Garamantes accelerated their danger. A thriving kingdom meant more people, more towns, more fields, and therefore more water drawn from the ground every year. The wealth that the Foggaras created drove the population upward, and the larger population demanded still more water, which meant still more Foggaras reaching still deeper into a shrinking supply. Prosperity and depletion fed each other. For centuries, none of this would have looked like a crisis. The decline of the water table was gradual, spread across generations, slow enough that any single lifetime might see only a minor worsening, a well dug a little deeper, a tunnel pushed a little farther. People adapt to slow change. They tell themselves it has always been hard, that the next stretch of digging will set things right, that the water has always come before and will come again. The danger of a slow catastrophe is precisely that it is slow. It hides inside the ordinary. And so, the Garamantes lived for a very long time in the shadow of a threat they may never have fully named. By all logic, a desert civilization drinking down an ancient, unrenewing aquifer was living on borrowed time. And yet, year after year, the water came, the dates ripened, the caravans set out for the north, and life went on, until at last the slope steepened and the long postponed reckoning began to arrive. By the middle centuries of the first millennium after the Common Era, the world around the Garamantes was changing as well, and not in their favor. To the north, the Roman order that had been their great trading partner was fraying and falling apart, disrupting the long-distance commerce that had brought wealth and prestige into the desert. The markets that had bought their goods and supplied their luxuries grew unstable. The artery of trade that ran through their hands began to weaken. At the same time, the deep environmental pressure never relented. The aquifers continued their long retreat. The Foggaras grew harder and harder to maintain, demanding ever more labor for ever less return, even as the society's wealth and capacity to organize that labor came under strain from the outside. A civilization that depends on enormous coordinated effort is terribly vulnerable to anything that weakens its ability to coordinate. The Garamantes were approaching a point where the effort required to survive might exceed the effort they could muster. This is the shape of the catastrophe to come, and it is worth naming clearly, because it is the heart of what the Garamantes have to teach us. Their collapse was not the work of a single enemy or a single bad year. It was a convergence, a drying environment, a depleting resource, a changing world beyond their borders, and a system stretched to its limit. A perfect storm gathering slowly over generations. In the second half of this story, we will follow that storm as it breaks and watch a civilization that farmed the Sahara with underground rivers finally run out of water. So now we return to the storm. We left it gathering over the Fezzan like a darkness that no one inside Garama could yet name. There was no single morning when the sky fell. That is the first thing we must understand about the end of the Garamantes. Civilizations rarely die in a day. They thin, they fray, they lose year by year the small certainties that once made their world feel permanent. For more than 1,000 years, these people had pulled life out of the deep rock. They had farmed one of the driest places on the surface of the earth, and they had done it not with rivers from the sky, but with rivers from below. Their wealth, their cities, their painted tombs, and their long caravans all rested on one quiet, invisible foundation. Water in the dark, water that had been sealed beneath the sand since the days when the Sahara was green, and that water was running out. Not because they were careless and not because of one bad season. It was running out because it had always been finite, and because for centuries they had been spending a fortune that could never be refilled. The storm that broke over the Garamantes was, at its heart, an arithmetic that no engineering could outrun. To see how the end arrived, we have to go back down into the dark. Picture again one of those underground channels, the Foggaras, the tunnels the Garamantes cut by hand through the gravel and the rock. Each one sloped gently for kilometer after kilometer, gathering water from the saturated ground and carrying it drop by patient drop out toward the gardens of Garama. They worked only because the water table sat high enough to seep into them. That was the whole secret. Tap the buried water where it lies and let gravity do the rest. But the buried water was fossil water. It was, for the most part, not being replaced. Rain almost never fell on the Fezzan. The aquifer had been charged in a wetter age thousands of years before, and once the Garamantes began draining it through hundreds of tunnels, the level beneath the desert began slowly to drop. At first, this would have been invisible. A Foggara that had run strong in a grandfather's day ran a little weaker in his grandson's. The fields at the far end received a little less. No one alarm sounded, but the line between water and dust was sinking year by year, just beyond the reach of those who depended on it. For a long time, the Garamantes had an answer. If the water sank, they would chase it. They would dig deeper. They would cut the tunnels longer, drive the mother wells further down, push the whole system harder against the retreating water. And for generations, this worked. It is part of why their civilization lasted as long as it did. They were stubborn and they were brilliant and they did not surrender easily to the desert. But here is the cruelty hidden inside that solution. Every meter deeper cost more. A longer tunnel meant more rock to break, more spoil to haul up the shafts, more lives spent underground in the heat and the dark, and the deeper the system reached, the more workers it demanded simply to keep the water flowing at all. The machine of their survival grew heavier the closer it came to failing. Archaeologists are careful here, and so should we be. We cannot watch a single Foggara die on a calendar. What the evidence suggests is a long, grinding contest between a sinking water table and a society digging ever harder to follow it down, a race that by all logic could only end one way. Consider what that race demanded of them. To maintain hundreds of kilometers of underground channel was not the work of a season. It was the permanent labor of a whole society, generation after generation. Tunnels silt up, roofs collapse. Walls must be cleared, shafts recut, new lengths driven forward as the old ones dry. The Foggaras system was less like a wall you build once and more like a living thing that had to be fed every single day, or it died. Scholars who study the Garamantes have pointed to one factor that made this possible, and it is not a comfortable one. Much of this brutal underground labor, the breaking and the hauling in the dark, is thought to have rested on the backs of the unfree. Captives drawn from the trade routes from the lands to the south, we separate what is documented from what is inferred, and here we are partly inferring. But a system this hungry for muscle needed a constant supply of it. And that supply, too, depended on a world that was about to change. The water that built the Garamantes and the labor that maintained it were both finite. When either one failed, the other could not save them. Now imagine standing at the edge of a Garamantian garden in the late years. Once this had been a green rectangle pressed against the desert, date palms and grain and the small bright order of cultivated rose. The Foggara had spilled its water here for as long as anyone remembered. But the water arriving now is a thread where once it was a stream. The far rows are already pale and dying. The family that farmed them has begun to argue about whether it is worth the digging anymore. This is how the collapse would have been lived, not as catastrophe, but as subtraction. One garden abandoned, then the one beside it. A tunnel left to silt because the hands that maintained it were too few. A village that simply has fewer people in it than it did when the elders were young. The bright order of the fields giving way, plot by plot, to the patient gray of the sand. The archaeology supports this slow reading. Across the Fezzan, we see settlements that contract rather than burn. Fewer houses occupied, cultivation pulling back toward the strongest, deepest wells, a civilization not struck down but quietly letting go. There is a terrible logic to how a system like this unwinds. It was held together by numbers. So many people to dig, so much water to grow the food, so much food to feed. The people who dig pull one thread and the others loosen. Less water means less food means fewer people, or hungrier ones. Fewer people means fewer hands to maintain the tunnels, and fewer working tunnels means still less water. The wheel that had turned in their favor for 1,000 years began near the end to turn against them. We should be honest about the limits of what we know. We cannot put a precise date on the breaking point, and the decline was almost certainly uneven, faster in some valleys than others, with recoveries and relapses we cannot fully trace. The broad picture, drawn across roughly the 4th to the 7th centuries of the Common Era, is one of long contraction rather than sudden ruin. But the direction never reversed. A society built to expand was now learning, for the first time in its history, only how to shrink. And what of Garama itself, the capital, the heart of it all? The city that had stood as the seat of kings, the hub where the caravans converged and the wealth of the deep desert was counted. Garama did not vanish in a single night either, but across these centuries it diminished. The grand became ordinary. The ordinary became empty. The satellite towns scattered across the Wadi al-Ajal, the towns that had ringed the capital like a constellation, dimmed one by one. We must hold two truths together here and not let either one swallow the other. The first is that the classic Garamantian state, the one Rome had once feared and traded with, the one whose engineers had threaded the desert with underground rivers, was fading. The second is that people did not simply disappear from the Fezzan. Some stayed, some moved. The oases were not all abandoned forever. Life in the desert is stubborn, and it persisted in poorer, smaller forms. What ended was not the human presence. What ended was the civilization, the scale, the ambition, the organized genius that had bent fossil water to the will of a people that was passing out of the world. While the Fezzan was thinning from within, the world around it was being remade from without. To understand the true end of the Garamantes, we cannot look only at the falling water table. We have to lift our eyes to the wider stage, to the empires and the religions and the trade routes shifting across the whole of the known world. The Roman power that at once defined the northern horizon of the Garamantes was itself in trouble. The provinces of Roman North Africa passed through upheaval, through invasion and reconquest, through the long unsettling of the late ancient world. The familiar markets that had bought the desert's goods, that had given the caravans a destination, were no longer the stable giants they had been. When the world you trade with changes, your own place in it changes too. The Garamantes had always been a bridge. They linked the Mediterranean shore to the lands beyond the sand, and they grew rich standing in the middle. But a bridge is only as useful as the two shores it connects. And both of those shores were now being rebuilt by hands the Garamantes did not control. Then, in the 7th century of the Common Era, a new force came out of the east, and it would reshape this whole region more completely than any drought. The armies and the faith of Islam swept across North Africa with extraordinary speed, and within decades the Arab expansion reached into the Fezzan itself. We should be careful and exact about what this meant, because it is easy to imagine a conquest as a single violent rupture. The records of these early campaigns into the deep desert are thin, and historians treat them with caution. What is clear is the larger pattern. The lands the Garamantes had known were being drawn into a new world, a world ordered by a new religion, a new language, and a new political order radiating from the cities of the conquerors. The classic Garamantian world did not so much fall to this new power as dissolve into it. Already weakened, already shrunken by the slow failure of its water, the old order had little left with which to resist absorption. The civilization that had farmed the Sahara with underground rivers did not end with a single battle. It ended by becoming part of something else. And traveling with this new world came an animal that would change the desert more than any army. The camel, the single-humped dromedary supremely adapted to heat and thirst and distance, able to carry heavy loads across stretches of sand that would have killed a horse or an ox. The Garamantes had known the chariot and the horse. Their rock art and their burials speak of a people who prized fast, proud animals who raced across the open ground in the days when the desert was kinder. But the camel belonged to a harsher Sahara, the very Sahara their own world had been drying into. As the camel caravan became the master of trans-Saharan travel, the geography of trade itself was redrawn. New routes opened, new stopping places rose, new peoples mounted on these tireless animals took command of the crossings, and the Garamantes, whose power had rested on controlling the old ways across the desert, found that the very map of the Sahara had shifted beneath them. The world had a new key, and it no longer turned in their hand. And then the silence. After the centuries of decline, after the absorption into a new faith and a new order, the Garamantes as a distinct civilization passed out of memory. The painted tombs were sealed by sand. The great wells stopped being cleared, the Foggaras. Those astonishing underground rivers ran dry and then ran with nothing, their tunnels collapsing slowly into the dark they had been cut from. For more than 1,000 years, the Fezzan kept its secret. The travelers who crossed it in later ages saw only what the desert wanted them to see. Low mounds, broken walls, the hard glitter of potsherds in the sun. Few of them imagined that beneath these quiet ruins lay the bones of a civilization that had once made the deep desert bloom. This is the part of the story that always stills me, that a whole world can lie so completely forgotten, that tens of thousands of tombs, the sleeping stone ancestors of an entire people, can wait beneath the sand for century upon century, asking nothing, remembered by no one, while empires rise and fall on the coast a few hundred kilometers to the north. But the desert is a strange keeper. It destroys, yes, it buries and it erases, and yet, in its dryness, it also preserves. The same aridity that had killed the Garamantes now protected what they left behind. In wetter lands, mud brick melts and wood rots and bone dissolves. In the rainless Fezzan, walls stood for 1,500 years. Grains and seeds survived. The dead lay undisturbed in their tombs, wrapped in the slow patience of the sand. The Foggaras themselves, though dry, still scored the land. Lines of access wells, each ringed by the spoil hauled out of it long ago, ran in their hundreds across the valleys like the stitching of some vast, forgotten garment. The eye on the ground might miss them, but they were there, waiting, written into the surface of the desert. Everything needed to reconstruct this lost world was still present, held in trust by the very emptiness that had swallowed it. The tombs, the tunnels, the towns, the trade goods, the bones of the people themselves. The Garamantes had not been destroyed. They had only been hidden. And what is hidden can, one day, be found. For most of recorded history, the Garamantes survived only as a rumor in other people's books. The writers of Greece and Rome had mentioned them, but mostly with contempt or with wonder, as wild people of the deep south, raiders and traders at the ragged edge of the civilized world. To the classical mind, they were a footnote, a name on the far margin of the map, half real and half legend. That verdict held for a very long time. When modern scholars first turned their attention to the Fezzan, many carried the old assumption with them. Surely these had been simple desert nomads, a thin and barbarous people scratching at the sand. Surely there was no real civilization out there, no cities worth the name, no engineering, no depth. The truth, when it finally came to light, would overturn that assumption completely. It would take a Roman footnote and turn it into one of the most remarkable lost civilizations of the ancient world. But to get there, someone first had to go out into that hostile, beautiful emptiness and look at the ground itself with new eyes. And that is the next chapter of our story. The modern recovery of the Garamantes is itself a long and patient story, and it is not finished, even now. Early excavations in the Fezzan during the 20th century began to hint that something larger had once stood here, that the tombs and walls belonged to more than mere nomads. But the fullest picture came later through the sustained work of archaeologists determined to take the deep desert seriously. Foremost among them is the British archaeologist David Mattingly, who led major fieldwork in the Fezzan, the project often known as the Fezzan Project and its successors. Over many seasons, his teams and their Libyan colleagues mapped the settlements, excavated the cemeteries, studied the Foggaras, and pieced together fine by fine the true shape of Garamantian society. What emerged was nothing like the old caricature. Here was a people with real towns and a real capital, with monumental tombs and imported luxuries, with agriculture, literacy borrowed from their neighbors, long-distance trade, and an irrigation technology of extraordinary sophistication. The deep desert had not been empty after all. It had held a kingdom, and careful hands were finally bringing it back into the light. And then the view changed, quite literally, by rising into the sky. Some of the most striking revelations about the Garamantes came not from the spade, but from above, from aerial photography and from satellite imagery. From the ground, the Foggara wells are easy to miss, scattered marks in a huge landscape. But from high overhead, a hidden pattern leaps into view. The images revealed the full scale of the system, hundreds of kilometers of Foggara lines, marked by their endless beaded rows of access wells threading across the valleys of the Fezzan. Settlements that no one had counted, field systems and cemeteries spread across a far wider area than anyone had supposed. From above, the desert was not blank. It was covered in the faint but unmistakable handwriting of an entire civilization. This is one of the quiet revolutions of modern archaeology, that we can read the past from orbit. The same satellites that watch our weather and guide our cars also let us trace, across 1,000 years and 1,000 square kilometers, the ghost of a kingdom written in wells and walls. The Garamantes had left their signature on the very face of the Sahara. We had only needed the height to see it. Put it all together, and a transformation has taken place in how we understand these people. The Garamantes have traveled in our own minds from a contemptuous Roman footnote to a recognized civilization of the ancient world. We now see them as the first known state to flourish in the central Sahara, as pioneers of large-scale desert irrigation, as a society that, for the better part of 1,000 years, did something we still find astonishing. They built a thriving urban culture in one of the most forbidding environments on the planet. This matters beyond the Fezzan. It reminds us how much of the human past still lies outside our histories, dismissed or unseen, waiting in places we assumed were empty. The story of the Garamantes is partly the story of how easily a civilization can be overlooked and how much patient work it takes to give a vanished people their due. They are no longer a rumor, they are a chapter, and yet even as we recover them, the very places that hold their story face new dangers in our own troubled age. For the sites of the Garamantes survived 1,500 years of silence only to meet new threats in our own time. The desert kept them safe through long centuries of forgetting. It is human hands now that endanger them. Libya in recent decades has passed through conflict and instability, and war is no friend to fragile ruins. Archaeological work that requires safety, continuity, and trust becomes almost impossible when a country is torn by violence. Worse, the breakdown of order opens the door to looting. The tombs that lay undisturbed for so long, the sleeping stone ancestors have in places been broken into and robbed, their contents scattered onto illicit markets, their stories destroyed for the sake of a few sellable objects. There is a bitter irony here that we should not look away from. A civilization that survived its own collapse, that outlasted drought and conquest, and 1,000 years of obscurity can still be erased in our generation, not by the desert, but by us. What the sand protected, our disorder can undo. And once a looted tomb is emptied, the knowledge it held is gone for good. No satellite, no archaeologist can ever recover it. And now we come to the part of this story that should make us sit very still, because the Garamantes are not only a tale about the distant past, they are a mirror, and what they reflect is us. Strip their story down to its bones, and here is what remains. A people found a vast store of fresh water sealed beneath a desert charged in a wetter age and never to be refilled. They built their entire civilization upon it. They grew, they flourished, they reached heights no one thought possible in such a place. And then, because the resource was finite and they were spending it faster than nature could ever replace it, they ran out. And when they ran out, the world they had built upon it could not stand. Now consider this, that same water is still there. The great body of fossil groundwater beneath the eastern Sahara, the Nubian sandstone aquifer system, is one of the largest reserves of ancient water on Earth. And in our own time, we have learned to reach it, not with hand-dug tunnels now, but with deep wells and powerful pumps. The Garamantes tap the edge of this treasure with the technology of antiquity. We are draining its heart with the technology of today. Stay with this, because it is the heart of why their story still matters. In Libya, the very land where the Garamantes once lived, a colossal modern project has spent decades pumping that ancient desert water northward to the coastal cities. It is called the Great Man-Made River, a vast network of buried pipelines drawing fossil groundwater from beneath the Sahara to slake the thirst of a modern nation. It has been hailed as one of the largest irrigation and water supply works in the world, and it draws on the same kind of water that built and then broke the Garamantes. Ancient, buried, finite, not meaningfully renewed by any rain falling today. Hydrologists are clear about the arithmetic. This water was laid down long ago, and once it is pumped out, it does not come back on any time scale that matters to human beings. We are spending on an industrial scale a savings account that took the wet ages of the Sahara many thousands of years to fill. The Garamantes ran the same experiment with simpler tools in the same desert. We know how their version ended. They thrived for 1,000 years, and then the water fell below reach and the thriving stopped. And this is not Libya's problem alone. Look out across the modern world and you will see the same pattern repeated on every inhabited continent. Beneath the plains of great nations, ancient aquifers that took ages to fill are being drawn down by deep pumps far faster than nature replaces them. We irrigate vast farms, we grow great cities, we build whole economies upon underground water that is, in human terms, finite. Around the world, hydrologists watch water tables falling year by year in many of the regions that feed us. Does that sound familiar? It is almost exactly the Garamantian arithmetic scaled up to the size of a planet, a buried resource, a growing demand, a society spending faster than the resource can ever return, and the same quiet, dangerous comfort the Garamantes must have felt that the water had always been there and so surely always would be. They were wrong, not because they were foolish, but because the water was finite and their faith in it was not. We separate fact from speculation in this story wherever we can. But the central lesson is not speculation, it is hydrology. Fossil water, once drawn down past reach, is gone. And a civilization that forgets this builds its house upon a vanishing foundation. So let us return one last time to the Fezzan, to the silent valleys where the Foggaras run dry beneath the sand and the tombs lie in their tens of thousands and the wind moves across the place where Garama once stood. Stand there in your imagination at the end of a long day when the light goes amber and then violet and the heat finally loosens its grip on the stone. Think of what was here. A people who looked at the deadest desert on earth and decided against all reason that they could make it live. Who went down into the dark and cut rivers out of solid rock, who raised cities and kings and painted tombs in a place where the sky gives no rain. For 1,000 years they did the impossible quietly, brilliantly, day after patient day, and then the foundation beneath them, the buried water that made it all possible, slipped away, and they could not follow it down forever. They were not destroyed by an enemy. They were not punished by the gods. They simply ran out of the one thing they could not live without, in the one place where it could never be replaced. There is no villain in this story. There is only a people and a desert and a finite store of water in the dark. The Garamantes remind us of something we are always tempted to forget, that no civilization, no matter how brilliant, is guaranteed to last forever. That ingenuity can carry a people very far, far enough to farm the Sahara with underground rivers and still not save them from an arithmetic they refused to face. They were, in the end, undone not by their weakness, but by the very thing that made them great, their mastery of a treasure that could only run out. And perhaps that is why their silence speaks so clearly to us now across all these centuries. They are not only the sleeping stone ancestors of the deep desert, they are a message written in dry wells and buried tombs, sent forward through time to a world that is at this very moment drinking deep from the same kind of vanishing water. They cannot warn us, so we must read the warning ourselves in the sand they left behind. Thank you for walking with me out into the silence of the Fezzan, into the story of a people who made a garden of the desert and then watched it fade. Wherever you are and whatever the hour, I hope you carry a little of their wonder with you. Rest well, and until our next journey into the forgotten world, I wish you a calm and peaceful night.